Осталось 3 секунды. 2, 1, 0.
This video is about how a 19-year-old boy changed the course of history.
By the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
That boy's name is Matthias Rust.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Exactly 38 years ago, during the Cold War, relations between the US and the Soviet Union were once again deteriorating. Tensions were at an uptick when the Reagan US Supremacy Doctrine and Strategic Defense Initiative were announced.
We could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies.
These made the Soviets very nervous, and many were opposed to it. Among them, Joe Biden.
Star Wars represents a fundamental assault on the concepts, alliances, and arms control agreements that have buttressed American security for several decades.
It is therefore with timid hope that a young Matthias Rust was awaiting the Reykjavik summit's results. This meeting in 1986 between US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev promised a sweeping nuclear arms control agreement. Matthias would be disappointed, however. At the end of the summit, no agreement was reached. It is in that moment that Matthias came up with an idea. If the higher-ups couldn't manage it, he would take things into his own hands. His plan? Go to Moscow and talk to Gorbachev himself. Being a nobody from West Germany, he couldn't exactly march through the borders and into the Kremlin. He had to do something extraordinary, something that couldn't simply be ignored. It is with that in mind that he approached the Uetersen airfield near Hamburg on the 13th of May, 1987. With only 50 hours of flight training, the 19-year-old got into his small Cessna airplane. His first destination? The Faroe Islands. From there, he flew on to Reykjavik. He wanted to visit the Holy House, where just 7 months before, the US and Soviet Union summit had taken place. Seeing the place where he had hoped peace would be achieved filled him with determination. From there, he flew to Bergen and then to Malmi, near Helsinki. By this time, it was the 28th of May. He told traffic control he was headed for Stockholm and took off. It was now or never. Instead of heading for Stockholm, he turned his plane towards Moscow. With the newfound courage he got from completing the Scandinavia trip so far, he put his chances of making it at 50%. Immediately, the Finnish Air Force picked up that he was off course, but lost track of him soon after. When Matthias reached eastern Estonia, he was officially in Soviet airspace. If detected, he would automatically be perceived as a threat, and his fears would be confirmed when only 60 minutes later he found himself face to face with a Soviet military aircraft. Of course he had been picked up on a radar and was now a target. After all, one does not simply fly into Soviet airspace. Matthias knew that this was likely the end and braced himself. But miraculously, the aircraft passed him by, and to Matthias's even bigger surprise, it didn't come back. Turns out Matthias was very lucky. The previous day had seen a crash in the area, and his plane was mixed up in the emergency operation that was carried out. It also helped that on the 28th, it's officially Border Guards Day in the Soviet Union, and focus on the Soviet side was lower than usual. Flying very low for approximately 5 hours, he was going from region to region, and he was sure that he should be in Moscow by now. He looked outside his window and saw long strips of highway entering a city. He had reached Moscow. His plan was to land on a red square next to the Kremlin. The only problem was, he didn't know where it was exactly. After circling the city for about half an hour, he spotted the St. Basil's Cathedral, and he knew that the red square would be right next to it. One last obstacle remained. As he was approaching the square to land, curious onlookers were blocking his way. He attempted to land multiple times, but to no success. And at this point, despite feeling relief for reaching his destination, he was exhausted. The adrenaline of the entire trip was catching up with him. He was getting desperate, but then spotted an opportunity. The bridge next to the red square. It was completely empty and would be perfect to land. He made his final descent and landed. As he taxied the airplane towards the red square, he felt satisfied. His dream had come true. He had absolutely no idea, however, that the consequences would be felt throughout the world. He had just changed the course of history. By the time he got out of the plane, A large crowd of excited onlookers had gathered around him. No one had ever witnessed something like this. He was an instant celebrity and was interviewed right then and there. The party wouldn't last long, however. As the authorities arrived, he got arrested immediately. Although Matthias didn't get to meet the Soviet leader, Gorbachev did use Matthias to his own advantage. So far, the Soviet nuclear disarmament talks had been somewhat undermined by prominent figures from the old guard, most notably in the military establishment. These figures were part of the reason why previous talks with the US had failed, including the Reykjavik summit. Gorbachev had been looking for an opportunity to fire his opposition, and he finally had it.
Shooting. No, I'm just fucking about.
Arguing that the military was to blame for the whole fiasco for even letting Matthias get past the border, Gorbachev used this opportunity to get rid of hundreds of officials, including the Minister of Defense, Sergei Sokolov, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Alexander Koldunov. With his opposition subdued, Gorbachev pursued talks with Reagan, and in December 1987, the historic Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty was finally signed. This eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons that were fueling the Cold War. Gorbachev didn't stop there, however. He used this momentum to implement wider reforms, both political and economic. Glasnost, or openness, made the political system more open and transparent. Perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to promote and implement a semi-free market system. Both of these reforms sped up the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union, giving power and freedom back to its people.
Это Горбачев.
You could say that Matthias succeeded with his stunt, against all odds. But what happened to him? 3 months after landing in Moscow, Matthias, despite being hailed a hero, was sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp for illegal entry into the country, violating flight regulations, and malicious hooliganism.
Shenanigans, skylarking, buffoonery.
Of that sentence, he served only 14 months before being released. People in the Soviet Union took it surprisingly well what he did.
I hope that Gorbachev will save him from prison because it's the wrong decision.
People in Moscow were jokingly calling the Red Square Sheremetyevo 3, a reference to the 2 Moscow airport terminals Sheremetyevo 1 and 2. And there you have it, the story of a foolish but courageous young man taking things into his own hands. But while you may admire his stunt, do not put him up on a pedestal. After doing a bit of research, it's clear now that Matthias peaked in his youth, as his later life would be slightly more problematic. He has reportedly been involved in fraud, convicted of stealing a cashmere pullover, and even stabbing a female co-worker who had apparently rejected him. And worst of all, he has reportedly been training to become a yoga teacher.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
And on that note, I hope to see you for the next one.